Hello, everybody. Hello, hello. I hope you are doing well. I hope you can hear me. Hello, say hi in the chat if you're here. I see Brian and I see Catherine already. Yay, and there's Amory. I'm so glad that y'all are here. Let us know if you can hear us okay, if you can see us okay. We're doing something brand new with a whole bunch of people, and it's very exciting, but we have a lot of tech going on behind the scenes. So let us know if something seems off. Otherwise, it's so great to be here with you all. I am here with the whole TMC staff. I am so excited. My name is Austin. I'm the executive director here at TMC, and we are pretty pumped to be doing Bible Study Live with you all again. And I'm so excited to be doing it with these wonderful people here with me. So we're all just going to introduce ourselves to get started. Like I said, my name's Austin. My pronouns are he, him. And I'm the executive director here at TMC. And we talked about saying what our favorite book of the Bible was to introduce ourselves. So I guess I will say that my favorite book of the Bible is probably Isaiah, because it's packed full of a lot of stuff. Just about anything, any kind of like upper downer kind of reading you want, Isaiah probably has it. Angry, lots of emotions in Isaiah. So that's me. Micah, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Hello, everyone. My name is Micah Melody. My pronouns are she, her, and I am going to be running tech today. So if I'm looking off to the side or if I'm like looking around, it's probably just I'm making sure everything's running well. But Austin, you took mine. I would also say Isaiah. I absolutely love Isaiah, and for very basically the same reasons that you said. It's like so packed with so many things. There's a lot of there's so much implication on a lot of the rest of the Bible and like so much interplay. And I absolutely love that.
Makes sense to me. Sorrel, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, so my name is Sorrel and I use they, them pronouns, and I am the spring pastoral intern here at TMC. And my favorite is Acts, just because Acts is like just the exciting account of like the church's beginnings. And I don't know, I just find something very like heartening about Acts. And I think it's partly because like, we are the church and like this was the church, in the book of Acts. So Acts is like pretty badass.
Accurate. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody describe Acts as badass before, but you are not wrong. Thanks, Sorrel. And how about you, Peter?
Hi, I'm Peter. Pronouns are they, them, or he, him. I am the brand new development coordinator here at TMC. I've been here, 6 weeks, I want to say. Just really happy to be here. It's so funny, we did not talk about this, but Sorrel, I was also going to say Axe. So we've got two teams, I guess, on the TMC staff. But yeah, I just find it really energizing. Just kind of how alive they were in the early church to the Holy Spirit and like how radically they were living out the message of Jesus. And I just draw a lot of like energy and inspiration from that. Also, it's very human and funny sometimes, like when you kind of realize that all of these squabbles and infighting that still go on in the church have just been with us forever. And there's a little bit of comfort in that, I think, too.
Totally. Yeah. Being able to look back and be like, they were wrestling with some of the same things we are still wrestling with today. Yeah, it's very human. Thanks, Peter. Well, awesome. Thanks for introducing yourself, everybody. I see all the folks in the stream. I see Kian, I see Chris, I see Nikki, I see Derelda. Oh my gosh, so many good names and people that I recognize. So glad that all are here. We have been talking about how we're going to do Bible study. Now that we're kind of coming back to it, there's going to be some new things and some old bits to it. We are going to start out by reading the passage that we're talking about tonight all together. So we're going to read it through once, and then we're going to kind of like pick it apart a little bit, like in a fun way, not in an annoying way, I hope. So we're going to start reading it all through together. You can see on the screen that we are tonight talking about John chapter 2, verses 13 through 22. So that is our passage for this evening. We picked it because it's a passage where Jesus causes a bit of a stir. And we've been talking here at TMC in our support groups about some of the connections between Pride Month and Pride and LGBTQI2A history and social movements and protest. And so we thought this was going to be a great story to talk about. If you are in our Transmission Ministry Collective Discord, which is for trans and gender expansive folks, we're going to continue talking about a different version of this story in our Bible study there this week. So it's very much all connected. So we're going to start out by reading the passage all together one time and just have a read. If you want to read this in whatever version you like to read it in, it doesn't matter. We're going to talk about some differences in different kinds of translations. So no matter how you read it, as long as you're reading it, that's the most important thing. So I'm going to put in the chat here a link to John 2 in Bible Gateway in case you need a copy if you don't have a Bible handy, so you can read along with us. So we're reading chapter 2, verses 13 through 22. So let's see. Let's have Sorrel, do you want to read it for us? I totally threw that on you suddenly. So
Cool. So 13 through 22. Jesus cleanses the temple. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple with the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken.
So this is a story that is full of complicated things. And so as we're reading this story all together, I thought that we would give a little bit of context of what's happening before this story, where it's settled in our gospel and in the wider category of all four gospels. And then we're going to ask you all in the chat what you notice about this passage and what jumps out at you. So be thinking about that for a second. But we're going to talk a little bit about like where this text is located. So two things. I'm going to talk about one thing, and then Peter's going to talk about one thing. One thing that I think it's important for us to remember anytime we read the Gospel of John is that John had the author or authors of the book of John were very intentional about creating different identities and a sort of separation in identities between the Jewish people living in Jesus's day and the people who were following Jesus. They wanted to make a distinction. Some scholars think that maybe what happened was that the community that John was a part of was kind of in a fight with the Jewish community at the time. And that's why John is so, he tends to blame the Jewish community for a lot of things. And so when we get things like in verse 18, where it says, the Jews said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" There tends to be kind of an antagonistic feeling in the book of John against the people, the Jewish people living in Jesus's time. And so it can be, the book of John can sometimes be used by Christian communities to sort of, can use it in sort of some ways that end up being pretty anti-Semitic. So whenever we read the book of John, we want to remember that even though John sometimes uses the phrase "the Jews" to talk about people who are in opposition to Jesus, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is a story about how the Jewish community was bad, that all Jews in this time or place were bad. We remember that Jesus himself was Jewish, right? And in terms of translation, some people argue that when John says the Jews in Greek, it should actually be translated as the Judeans, the people living in Judea at the time. So I just wanted to preface that, as whenever we talk about John, remembering that whenever it says the Jews and we read the Jews as like the enemy in the story, that there's a lot of history underneath that. And we have to be very careful about how we think about that in Christian community. So that's one sort of thing I wanted to talk about in terms of prefacing this story. Peter, what can you tell us about where this is in John's gospel? What happens before it? And then like, how is it different from the other three gospels?
Yeah, this is, well, interestingly, it's one of the few stories that shows up in all four gospels, which is always something to kind of note. So all four, writers or groups of writers thought it was really important to include. But it's placed differently in John's gospel than it is in the synoptic. So it comes much earlier. In the synoptics, it is set the week of Jesus' death, after the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. In John, it happens right at the beginning. So the thing that happens right before this in the story in John is the wedding feast at Cana and that miracle at the wedding feast. So a lot of scholars think that maybe one of the reasons John decided to place it here is because, for one thing, to kind of emphasize its significance, like this is an important story, but specifically to kind of set up a framing for Jesus' mission. And maybe to sort of place it as a companion piece to the miracle of the wedding at Cana. So both of the two of those miracles are kind of defining or encapsulating what Jesus' mission is about. So the wedding feast at Cana being this sort of like abundance and grace, outpouring of abundance. And then this story being maybe more about the upending of dominant structures of power. So those two things being kind of the two points of emphasis of Jesus' mission. And then all of the gospels place it during the feast of Passover. And that is, the feast of liberation, of freedom. So that also has a connection, I think, to that idea of upending dominant structures of power, kind of, leading us into freedom and liberation.
Totally. So there's a lot about like where this passage is placed that can tell us, number one, what the author of the book is trying to tell us about who Jesus is. And number two, this sort of setting in and amongst Passover tells us something about liberation, tells us something about like this, for the writers of these stories, made sense to them. It was part of a theme. So that's just some background into when this story happens and where it happens. So bringing it to y'all in the chat, I wonder what are the first things that jump out to you about this story? When you look at the story that we just read, is there a specific verse, or is there specific something that is said, or a specific word, a specific feeling that comes out for you? What jumps out to you about this text? What's something, and we don't have to go in order of the verses. So anything that you notice, let us know in the chat and we'll talk about it a little bit. While we're waiting for some of your answers, Micah, what do you notice in this text? What's something that jumps out to you?
So the first thing that kind of I noticed is just a lot of the specific detail that John puts in there. So John describes the temple courts, and specifically describes the animals and also who's in the temple courts. And so there's a lot of animals that are named specifically. There's sheep, oxen. There are doves named a little bit later. Jesus also names, or John also names like the people that are there, and specifically the money changers. And when I was reading this, I was just imagining the scene and kind of like putting myself in the scene, and just imagining the chaos of what's happening. So like, imagine Jesus like going into this space. It's already got to be an incredibly noisy space, because this is, that's a huge contrast, because this is a place of worship and prayer. And there's all these animals. There are a bunch of people buying and selling. that's happening. And then Jesus comes in and just like starts setting all, like basically chasing the animals out, overturning the tables of the money changers. So I imagine like hearing the coins like scatter on the ground. There's like, and so I, putting myself in that scene, it's makes me wonder what I would do if I was an observer or if I was a participant and one of the worshipers. And I would love to ask that of you all in the chat too. Like as you're, you know, thinking about what you're noticing, like if you're putting yourself in the scene, like what would you do if you were one of the people in the temple courts in this time? Like I wonder if I would not be tempted to go grab some of the coins that are just laying on the ground, or you maybe there's free animals and I'm like gonna go get some of the animals like that are running around. I mean, chaos, maybe like there's a lot of different things. So yeah, what would you do as well, like as well as things that you're noticing, like what would you do in this situation?
That's such a good question. And yeah, that's a very classic, like Lectio Divina type thing, to place yourself in the story and think about what you would be smelling and hearing and tasting and feeling and whatever, using your senses in the story. And I had never thought about that. Yeah, if coins are just flying all over the place, you know, there were some people that were like, I'll just take this. Yeah, thanks, Micah. I notice Catherine here in the chat says, I noticed the interpretive interjection into the story. John doesn't just tell the story, but interprets Jesus's words for the reader. Yeah, definitely. In hang on, which verse is it? In verse 21, right? Where Jesus says the thing about, I will raise it up in 3 days. And the people are like, what? How can you do that? And then we get this interpretation here in verse 21. He was speaking of the temple of his body. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to note. In John's version, John is telling us what John thinks is happening. And yeah, I wonder, I don't know, Sorrel, Peter, Micah, do you have any thoughts about that? Sometimes when there's like an interpretation of like, this is what Jesus meant, I'm always like, how did you know?
Well, I think it's interesting that John says that when the disciples look back. So I think there's this little moment of hindsight maybe that's coming up and like, oh, maybe this is potentially what Jesus was talking about. You know, like there is this moment of in the future, like this is how they're interpreting it, having experienced all the things that came after. And so I appreciated that there is a note that about when the disciples look as what is the I'm trying to remember. Oops, that's the wrong screen. Um, uh, where is it? The after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this. So I think that's really an interesting thing, that there is a moment of looking back and seeing and like interpreting through a new lens that's happening right in the text. It's very interesting.
Totally. Yeah, that sometimes and I think this was true, that we see it in the Gospels and in Acts as well, speaking of Acts, where it's like they only understand things looking backward, right? That they're like, oh, now I can see it all. I can put the pieces together. Derelda says, no one seems to scold Jesus for what he did. Instead, they ask him for a sign. Do you think this means that there was some level of tacit approval for what he did? Yeah, there's that moment where nobody is like, Jesus, stop doing it. They say, what sign can you show us to prove that like this was a good thing to do, or you were worthy of doing this thing? It's a really interesting question that they asked. Any thoughts on that, anybody? I wonder about that bit of tacit approval, like who was approving, who was not approving. When it says the disciples look back and they understood, that's one thing. Did the disciples in the moment try to calm Jesus down? Because, oh, go ahead, Peter.
Or were they participating?
Right.
Like there's some sense that maybe there's a coordinated effort going on here.
Right. And like oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, it is really interesting that we don't really hear about anyone's response. We don't really hear a response from like the authorities. We don't hear a response from the disciples or just the people who were there, in the temple, like doing different transactions or worshiping or whatever they were doing. it almost does seem to me to imply that there must have been some level of coordination or support from the people around him.
Yeah, and
I
there's
think,
oh, go for it, Sorrel.
so I think like kind of riding off that wave that Peter talked about, like one thing that I noticed was that, and we talked about this earlier this week, that like Jesus took time to make the whip. Or it must have taken time because it's like it talks about how he made the cord. Like he didn't find it, he didn't buy it. Um, uh, and so it makes me wonder, like this was planned, maybe, or like it wasn't just like a I'm impulsive, which like I think that you know sometimes when we like Jesus is obviously angry in his story, and like I think there's a lot of times people want to either talk about like whether or not we should talk about the story or not, because it's like anger can be vilified in church spaces. um and I think that here like Jesus kind of gives us a little bit of um just kind of like his own relationship with anger, of just like, okay, like I'm mad, and I have a plan. Like, I'm not just like acting on impulse, I'm making a whip. Like, and so I think like maybe like what Peter was talking about, there might have been like some kind of plan, like no one stopped him. Like maybe other people knew that he was making this whip. Um, like how long does it take to make a whip? Like, I don't know. Um, so those are just some things that I've noticed.
Yeah, I love the image of Jesus just like angrily weaving this whip together. Like that's very kind of satisfying to me to think about. But I read this really cool piece by Verdell Wright, that drew a connection between this story and the uprisings in Ferguson after the murder of Michael Brown by police. And so he really talks about this as like an intentional act of protest and defiance. And I wrote down this quote because I loved it, really about, you were saying sort of like how anger is vilified, or not seen as something that we as Christians can uh, have. Um, but he said, God is not afraid of anger, and sometimes the only way to create an environment for change is to shut everything down and declare enough is enough. I just really liked that quote, that God is not afraid of anger, and God in the person of Jesus expressed anger. Like that's something we have as a model.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Peter. I just put in the chat both an article that Peter just read from, and then also an article that Sorrel found really helpful. So both of those are in the chat for folks if they want to read more about how anger is relevant here. I think that's a really good question to talk about. Like, how do we imagine Jesus experienced anger? And yeah, Amory says Jesus was passionate. Yeah, like and in this text, the word they use is zeal, right? The zeal for your house will consume you. Like this idea of anger that might not be, so many of us have a negative experience with anger, and anger is like a negative thing. And to see Jesus doing something in a way that seems angry, but like maybe it's a different way of thinking about anger than we may have thought about before, or that maybe we have experienced. I love that you brought that up, Sorrel, about the time that it takes to braid that whip, because it wasn't a quick thing. And that, I think, plays into Peter's sense of like, maybe the disciples were in on this. Maybe they were sitting there watching him braid and being like, what are you going to do? I see Isaac says, I always think that the how do you know when the omniscient narrator explains something bad happening to all of Israel because they did XYZ in like numbers. Yeah, so there's definitely some connections to other passages and a lot of things about looking back and trying to make sense of things. Kian says, the first thing I think of is how selling in the temple courts might have been totally normal to people, and they didn't think twice about it until Jesus drew attention to what they were doing, which kind of connects to that quote that you just gave us, Peter, this idea of like, sometimes things are just normal, and you don't realize that something is wrong until somebody is like, hey, wait a minute, something is not okay here.
That,
Go
I was
ahead.
gonna say that kind of reminds me of like how in the article that I linked down, it talks about anger as a blessing, and especially like if people are normalizing something, it can be a blessing for someone to like actually like be in touch with like their gut and their body and their heart and their mind and just say like enough is enough, you know. Because like if they're, you know, a lot of times like when people, there's like this sense of like routine and numbness of just like, oh, this is just how things are, and like this is an act of disruption that Jesus is doing, of just disrupting the like maybe the routineness of what is happening in the temple. Austin, you're muted.
Oh no. I think the big question when it comes to this story in general is the question of what is Jesus mad about? Because we see what Jesus does, but I think it's really open to interpretation in terms of like what Jesus is like trying to like rail against. And part of the reason that it's complicated is because it's different in the synoptic gospels and in John's account. Yet again, there's a difference. So Micah, would you talk to us a little about the wording difference in John versus in the synoptics?
Sure. So it's really fascinating that there is such a difference in emphasis. On top of what Peter is saying of like um, where in the gospel stories it appears, it appears at the beginning, but the wording and what all the synoptics include, basically they emphasize that Jesus saying, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers or a den of thieves. And so in the other three gospels, that's what Jesus says. But here, Jesus calls, the wording is specifically, take these things out of here, stop making my father's house a marketplace. So on first glance, that seems like it's very similar, but the actual language used, like, even in the Greek, it's completely different. Den of robbers or den of thieves, it has the connotation of like the den. It's a dwelling place of like treachery. Um, and the marketplace is the word that's just used for a generic everyday marketplace in the Greek world. And so even the fascinating difference that's happening there, there's something that's being shifted. And the synoptics also, they all the synoptics, when they reference my house shall be a house of prayer, that is directly out of Isaiah 56. And there is also, but you have made it a den of robbers. That is out of Jeremiah, and I can't remember the exact passage. But here it is like completely changing that context. So I like why do you think that there's this change of language and emphasis on what Jesus says? This and the broader question of what Austin posed is like, what is John communicating that Jesus is doing or Jesus is angry about here?
Yeah, so folks in the chat, why do you think that in three gospels Jesus says this is supposed to be a house of prayer for everybody, don't make this a den of thieves or a den of robbers, and in John's version Jesus just says don't make this place a marketplace? I wonder what you all think about why John is different than the other three, and why, like, what do you think John is getting at? What do you think John is mad? What do you think John thinks Jesus is mad about? So we're kind of trying to read two different minds here. We're trying to read John's mind and read Jesus's mind. But I wonder what you all think. What was Jesus mad about? What was he pushing back against? There's a lot of different ways we can think about that. Peter, I think you had a note about that idea of like the den of robbers in the synoptics. You had an idea about what that den of robbers might look like.
Yeah, I came across something from Damon Garcia, who has a book coming out called The God Who Riots, I think later this year. But it was a video like promoting his book, and apparently he talks about this story at length. But he mentioned the fact that a den of robbers isn't somewhere where the stealing takes place. It's like where the robbers go back to hide from accountability. So basically thinking about like the religious authorities who were in charge of these temple sacrifices and stuff, they were doing so in an exploitative way, and then using the temple as like a shield for their unjust actions, like this exploitation. Basically sort of using the temple, using worship, or using the sacred as a shield for injustice. So that's kind of seems to be the connotation of den of robbers.
Totally. Yeah. I love that difference in understanding it. It's not necessary. It's like, this is the excuse we're using for these bad things that we're doing. I found my resource, one of my resources that I was looking at for this was the Queer Bible Commentary. And Robert Shore Goss has an article in here where he talks about the sort of den of robbers thing in the synoptics. And he connects it to the way that he basically says Christian groups today that pour money into anti-LGBTQI2A legislation are acting like robbers by taking money and then taking away health and life from queer and trans people. So he connects it by saying, like, Jesus is acting against this idea of people using that sort of religious shield to take things away from people. And so I thought that was a really interesting connection, that like oftentimes church groups today are taking people's wealth and turning it into really harmful legislation, and that's a thing that we're constantly working against. So maybe that's part of what Jesus was mad about, was kind of a similar thing. I see. Oh, go ahead, Micah.
Oh, I was going to say, I see a note from Amory about were there class distinctions according to the kinds of size of the animals being sacrificed? And yes, there are. And there's actually, when I was looking at the passage, there is in Leviticus, there are provisions given for people who cannot afford certain types of animals for sacrifice. And all of the animals that are mentioned, oxes, sheep, the doves, all of those are connected to sin offerings in Leviticus. So offerings for sin and guilt. And oxen were offered up in like the broader context when a community has transgressed. But then the sin offering in Leviticus, and it's in let's see, Leviticus. Leviticus 4 and 5 is where all of this is found. And in Leviticus 5, there are some provisions that are given if people can't afford a sheep. They are given, basically, there's a provision that instead they can offer 2 doves. And then later in Leviticus 5:11, there's an additional provision that's given if people can't afford even 2 doves. They can offer it's like a tenth of an ephod of grain, which I think if I did the conversion right, that's like just under a pound of flour. So if you think of like just buying like a pound, like one of those like pound things of flour, and that's about the amount that they would be offering. So in comparison, that's what, people who couldn't afford live animals could offer. But one thing I noticed is that there's no mention of the flour at all in this passage. There's only mention of the animals and the specific animals that are connected to the sin offering. So I'm wondering if that was an intentional like mention, or if that, or like intentionally left out, or if what is the connection to money that's being implied here or and criticized?
Totally. One of the pieces that I came across in the Jewish Annotated New Testament, which is a great resource for seeing how Jewish folks read the stories about Jesus, which is really fascinating. But one of the things they talked about was the temple exchange rate, and how part of what Jesus might have been pushing back against here was essentially extortion, that like people would have been, well, maybe extortion is not the right word, but like when people would have been going to the temple to buy the animals for different kinds of sacrifices or offerings, the exchange rate sucked essentially. And it was like intentional to kind of get more money from people than they should have given. And so maybe that's what Jesus was talking about. I see Chris says, I think it's all similar. Jesus is unhappy with their capitalism, agenda, and greed. Marketplaces and robbers are concerned about monetary gain rather than the spiritual things. So maybe this is a monetary thing.
Can you imagine the price gouging that's like taking place of people who are like, oh yeah, you can't afford a sheep. Well, I can sell you this dove, and then you can do that. But like when the laws were put in place and when the stipulations, it was people offering from their own flocks because they were a people on the move, and so that is part of what they had. And so thinking about it this way, if once you have people moving into more residential, life in the city or coming from all over to the temple, and they can't bring a sheep or they can't bring doves with them from however far away they've come, that they're kind of forced to do that. And yeah, so I think that is definitely that kind of putting people in a position where they have to spend money in order to worship, and they have to spend a lot.
Yeah, and it's definitely not something that is this is not something that is distinct to like First Temple Judaism. This is a situation of like when religion gets institutionalized, this is the kind of stuff that tends to happen in lots of places.
Well, and think about what was at stake if these are sacrifices for like ridding yourself of sin. It's like either pay this price or you won't be able to like become, purified or holy. It's this barrier, like economic barrier that's placed between people and God.
It kind of makes me wonder, like, especially if the dove is the one that's like the.
Oh, you're a little bit muffled there, so I think your mic might be muted.
Oh,
there you go.
Yeah, I was saying like it kind of made me wonder if, especially if the dove is the one that is the more affordable one, other than the flower, if that's why John singles out like that Jesus like approached the dove sellers, even though the cattle sellers and the cattle and the sheep were still there in the story. And also I saw that in the other accounts, the cattle and the sheep are not mentioned. It's just a dove. And I was wondering initially if that was intentional. And maybe it is. Maybe it is intentional that John singles out the dove in this story.
Totally. It's interesting that I like the very first thing you said there about like maybe Jesus is intentionally treating the dove sellers differently. Like that might be something that's happening here, because basically what we have is it's like in verse 15 it says he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and cattle. He poured out the coins, money changers overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, take these things out of here. So like he seems to treat the dove sellers differently than the other people. What a curious thing.
They were the ones specifically preying on the poor.
Maybe.
I mean, if I mean, and there's no way to fully know this because it's not directly in the text, but if we can, with just the inference of the thing that's not mentioned is the flower. So it makes me wonder if there was no flower as an option, even. And the only option was for people who were poor to buy doves. And especially people who were coming from a long way away, you probably don't want to carry a lot of flour with you. So like thinking about that definitely there could be that singling out of people who were specific, like the people who are specifically taking advantage of the poor. And I also just noticed that Darrell that like said in the chat that study notes your Bible point to the fact that this is probably in the outer court that where there were non-Jews were allowed. And yeah, that is definitely was probably at play. And for people who aren't familiar with the temple, like basically imagine a series of concentric like rectangles. So on the outer court, anyone can come in, and that's where like non-Jews could come in and they could be close. And then on the next line in, it was all the Jews. And then inside that were Jewish men. And then inside that, it was the whole, like basically the Holy of Holies, where only the priests could go. So there were, and God was seen to dwell in and understood to dwell in that Holy of Holies. So the closer you were to God, or like physically, you were literally physically close to God. But if the selling is happening in the outer courts where the non-Jews were being, they couldn't even worship in that space either. And there is, and I always, personally, I would always connect in the synoptics when Jesus says, like, my house is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations specifically, that there is a criticism of the exclusion of migrants and non-Jews in this space.
So basically,
Totally.
Jesus trying to like break down barriers to accessing God.
Mhm. Yeah, it's, you see it especially in Mark. In Mark's version, it's very specifically like for all nations or for all peoples. So yeah, I think you're on to something there, Durelda, where you say Jesus is trying to preserve their access to the temple without disruption by a busy marketplace. I think you're right on the money there. It's on the money as we're talking about
Yeah, I
money
was
in the
gonna
temple.
say that was clever.
I didn't mean to, unintentional. Well, one thing that I think is an interesting thing to think about here with Jesus and what he's doing is that sometimes this story about Jesus, you know, and the whip in the marketplace is used to kind of talk about Jesus and violence. Sometimes it's used to kind of argue Jesus would be for physical violence, or like, I'm going to put my sort of resource here in the chat, which is an academic paper. So forgive me for that, but it's open access, so anybody can read it. But it specifically talks about Jesus and violence and nonviolence. And one of the things that they point out is that for a long time in Christian history, up until St. Augustine, everybody assumed that Jesus was like completely nonviolent. And it wasn't until St. Augustine and some of his commentary that Augustine started writing about the idea of a just war and just war theory. And he used the example of Jesus and the whip to say Jesus would be okay with violence under certain circumstances. And so I think a lot of times this can be a really interesting conversation about like the use of violence. When is it okay? When is it not okay? And when I was reading through this passage, I was realizing how that conversation can also be very similar to conversations in queer and trans spaces, in like movements for justice in general, about like, when is, for instance, destruction of property okay versus when is it not? Do all protests have to be completely nonviolent? Do they not? So there's a lot that we could talk about there in terms of like Jesus and what he's doing. I wonder what you all notice, you in the chat and folks here in the virtual room with me. What do you notice about how Jesus uses violence, or does Jesus not use violence? What do you think? It's a big question, so if we all have to stop and think about it for a moment, that is fine. And it may take a minute for the stream to catch up with us. It looks like maybe we're having some stuttering issues here, so we'll see. One thing that was pointed out in this resource that I just dropped in the chat is that people who point out that like what Jesus is doing with the whip, they say that it's clear from the Greek that Jesus is not actually using the whip on people. Like Jesus is not whipping people. The point of the whip for Jesus seems to be moving the cattle out of the way. That was what he was using. And I will tell you, as somebody who used to work on dairy farms, that just yelling at cows often will not make them move. Often you have to like prod them a little bit, hopefully in a kind way, but it's really hard to move cattle without pushing them or or like moving them in some way. And so there's a really good basis for saying that what Jesus was doing was not physically hurting people, that all Jesus was doing was moving the cattle out of the way. And that's why it says he moved them all out But then it says, and then Jesus talked to the people selling doves. So maybe he moved them all out is talking about the cattle and not all of the people. So I wonder what you all think about that. I see Catherine says it doesn't talk about Jesus whipping people, just clearing things out. And Isaac says, I'm thinking about structural violence and how most people wouldn't think of it as violence 100 years ago, much less 2000 years ago. Right. So like, what even is violence? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, that seems like the big question to me. I mean, maybe some things are kind of getting conflated here a little bit too, because, you know, when you talk about violence in terms of like intentionally harming another person versus you mentioned, Austin, damaging property, you know, that seems like a very important distinction to make. And if we're just kind of like talking about that all broadly under the umbrella of violence, we're not pulling out those distinctions.
I wonder if that gets tricky though, because in some points in history, people were seen as property. Yeah. So I wonder if that gets really dicey or unclear. The other thing I wanted to say too is I've had other people liken what Jesus is doing in as kind of like a direct action, if anyone's familiar with direct action, which is basically when you take some kind of, literally a direct action, like to basically like protest something or to call attention to something, to bring awareness to, like there's so many different ways to do a direct action. Like there's, I think, a resource somewhere that's like a list that says like 1,000, like a list of 1,000 different ways to do a direct action. Like if you think of like a die-in, which is when people like lie on the ground and like act like they're dead to maybe bring awareness to some form of violence happening to people, or like a stay-in, which is like when people like occupy a building and don't leave. So yeah, I've also kind of wondered too, like, direct actions most of the time are led by nonviolent movements. Every once in a while, you'll have a direct action that isn't. But typically, it is a tactic of nonviolent movements. Sorry, my like I studied conflict nerd is coming out. And yeah, like I kind of wonder how it would change things if we saw what Jesus is doing as like some kind of direct action, if you will.
Yeah, and like along the same lines too, the idea of violence or the idea of non-violence often gets weaponized against people performing direct action, or people dissenting, people challenging structures of power. Like often that'll kind of be thrown in people's face of like, aren't you committed to non-violence? Why did you, set this fire, or why did you do this this action that is then being interpreted as violence to silence people, or stop that dissent from happening.
Totally.
Yeah, that also makes me think about like the expectation that the savior was going to be someone who was not Jesus basically, but someone who like might like take up arms. Just another thought that came to mind. And then my last thought for now is like kind of along what Peter was talking about, was also like how like even in like movements such as like the civil rights movement, there was like a strain of like nonviolence, but then there were people who were more not violent. I mean, not nonviolent, not non-violent, and how those two movements like working parallel to each other, kind of influenced how people thought about nonviolence. So it's just like seeing people resist in ways that were violent, or more like not necessarily nonviolent, made people be more accepting of nonviolent movements. Whereas like perhaps like if you only have the nonviolent movement alone, a person might still be dismissive of the nonviolent movement. Does that make sense at all? Yeah,
Totally.
there's like a book on that subject. If I think about it, I will mention it eventually.
Yeah, let us know if you think about it. That's a really good point. That like, and it reminds me of one of the things we've been talking about this week in TMC support groups, where we've talked about protest and movements for change that require all different kinds of people and all different kinds of actions. That like, there's not one way to get things done. I see Anita here mentioned the verses in Matthew where Jesus says, I came not to bring peace, but a sword. And it's like, that's one of those like bits about Jesus that is so interesting, because in other places, Jesus says that he doesn't come to bring violence. And so like, maybe the diversity that we see in the person of Jesus is not so much contradiction as it is showing many different ways that things can be done, right? Maybe it's not one or the other. Maybe it's not a binary choice of nonviolent or violent. Maybe it's more complicated than that. I see Isaac says disruption and shaming and coercion can be violent, but aren't necessarily. And Kian says, I see Jesus's behavior as more one of force than of violence. And I think that's an important distinction. Speaking softly doesn't always work and wouldn't have here. Yeah, it's when you bring up that speaking softly, Kian, it reminds me of how Jesus like does one thing with the animals and the money changing tables and then speaks to the people with the doves. So even in this one story, Jesus is using different ways of pushing people.
A diversity of tactics, if you will.
Exactly. Direlda says Jesus even seems to be limiting violence toward property, with the money changers getting the worst of it. And we're not told if he allowed the money changers to pick up their spilled money. That's a very good point, Direlda. What happened to that after the fact? That kind
Maybe
of
a little wealth redistribution happening.
Possibly.
I mean, if I was in that place, I'd be like, well, that's mine, and that's no. I did want to note though about the speaking softly and how Jesus like goes and talks to the people selling doves. Like the passage, like the wording is, he told those who were selling doves, take these things out of here, exclamation mark, stop making my father's house a marketplace, exclamation mark. So there's like very, even in the wording, it's not like a soft spoken, this is a Jesus who is like, there is a forceful wording that's happening here, and in a command that's going on. And so, going back to the complexity of the conversation around violence and nonviolence, and some like the number of times I've heard like people be like, well, maybe if you talked a little bit or more, or maybe if you like did X, Y, and Z and did a little bit differently, people would be more inclined to listen to you. But that's not, like if we're looking at that and drawing parallels and modeling from Jesus, like Jesus is pretty forceful in his language here. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, as we're wrapping things up here in our last bit of time together, I wonder for everybody, all the folks in the room and all the folks in the chat here, how do you think this story influences the way Christians should act in social movements? Do you think, like, is there something that we can learn from this story about how we protest, how we do direct action, how we do or don't use violence, how we talk to people? What can we learn from this story as Christians working for social change? Anybody have any thoughts? I think the main thing that I take away is that Jesus is a complex figure, and I can't assume that I know always what he's about. There's always something new to learn. And I really feel like I'm taking away that sense of like Jesus using a diversity of tactics. That seems like it's sticking with me.
That's what's also sticking with me too, because I didn't think about that in the beginning of this discussion. Yeah, I think I especially like growing up in a lot of the Christian like nonviolent peace and conflict circles, like pacifist circles. Like I was taught to just think about Jesus as resistance in one way, and then being exposed to other people who practice nonviolence, but were in a different social location because the previous context I had were like majority, like cis white people, and then this other context was a lot of like like queer trans people of color um, committing to like what does it mean to be nonviolence, and the approaches were completely different. Um, and so, yeah, like just thinking about how like violence or nonviolence, like these are not like static or object. I mean, yeah, like there is no like objective understanding of these things, it seems.
Yeah, I see. Derelda says maybe we can reconcile Jesus's different approaches by remembering Ecclesiastes 3, particularly that for everything there is a season and for a time for every matter under heaven. Yes, that's the idea of different different strokes for different folks, essentially, is what we're talking about there. Kian says, first and foremost, think about who is being left out or prevented from living their fullest lives and advocate for them. Absolutely. If we believe that this story is about Jesus advocating for a house for all people, for space for people that would be kept out of other spaces, that is exactly, I think, a great thing to take away from this story. I see some shaved sheep. That's a hard one to say. They say, I think as I approach those with whom I may not agree, I must approach them with the love I would want them to approach me about my beliefs and ethics. Totally. Yeah, I can see that. What other thoughts do folks have?
I think for me, I think Kian's point there, thinking about who's being left out, just reminds me of the concept of sociological imagination, and the idea. I learned of sociological imagination first from Christina Cleveland, and Dr. Cleveland has a wonderful. If we can find it, I would love to put it in the comments afterwards. But there is a great post about Jesus, like even use as a person of privilege as well as like oppression, and using Jesus's position of power to advocate for the people who were not there. And it takes imagination to do that. And so thinking first and foremost about who is being left out, who's not here, and who is being prevented from being here, that maybe things are normalized, as someone mentioned earlier, and maybe it's just so normal for the temple to be a market, but maybe that's preventing people from being here.
Well, thanks, everybody. I put Dr. Cleveland's website in the chat there in case people want to check her out. She's an amazing teacher. Catherine says, it makes me think about what I'm willing to put up with and what I'll take a stand against. Yeah, this is like a good story about Jesus having good boundaries, I think, in some ways too. Well, thanks, everybody. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us tonight. It's been so great to talk with you and to hear your thoughts. Thank you to all of the TMC staff members who have been here tonight. It's been so great talking about this story with you. I've got a couple of announcements before we go. The first one is that our next Bible Study Live, we're going to now do this once a month. Our next Bible Study Live is happening on July 20th. At 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, so same time on July 20th. So we're going to be doing this once a month now. I believe it's the third Wednesday or second Wednesday. I forget which. Somebody remind me. Third Wednesday. So July 20th is the next one of these. So you'll get more information about that. Also, two more things that are happening right now. One is that we have a workshop coming up 1 week from tonight called Church Lessons from the Public Universal Friend with Diana Anderson. And it is basically going to workshop. I put this in here. This is a workshop on a preacher, a Quaker preacher who was non-binary from the 1700s. And that's coming up a week from today. And so if you want to get information about that, I put that in the chat. And then finally, we have our June fundraiser happening right now. We always have a Pride Month fundraiser. There we go. We always have a fundraiser happening in June, and we just today announced that we have a $5,000 matching donor. So any donation you give to TMC from now until the end of June is going to be matched. So you automatically double your donation to TMC to make sure that things like this workshop and our support groups that happen every week, multiple times a week, and our Discord server runs, and you pay these lovely people here. So if you want to help make TMC the wonderful place that it is, please go check out our fundraiser. Anything else I'm missing, everybody? I think we got it all. All right. Well, then we will sign off for tonight. Thank you so much for being here, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.